Hi, this is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles podcast. On Saturday, February 4th, I'm recording in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'll be heading back to Florida early tomorrow morning. 2 days ago, on February 2nd, I interviewed Chris Bailey, whose new book is How to Calm Your Mind, Finding Presence and Productivity in Anxious Times. And I've read the book carefully. I've been listening to interviews that Chris has done since its release on December 26th. So I just had a lot that I wanted to talk about. I could have talked probably for another hour. As it was, he was very generous with his time, and this interview is just about an hour long. I began by suggesting that he and I sit in silence for a couple of minutes before we start our conversation. I've done that a couple of times before, and it helps me, I know, to just enter into a conversation in a calm way. And since calm is the topic of this book, and since meditation is one of the key topics that he discusses, I thought that would be a good way to start. So here is our conversation recorded on Zoom. I'm also going to be posting the video on YouTube, so you'll be able to see Chris and my conversation in YouTube as well as here on the podcast. And after the interview, I'll have a few thoughts. Since you and I are both meditators, I wondered if we could just start with 2 minutes of silence before we start. Then I'll include that in the show in hopes that people will have a little taste of what we're talking about. And I got a timer here that'll give us a bell in 2 minutes. So let's go.
All right.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I listened to some conversations you've had about the book, and I know that you are someone who is frequently fascinated by the things that you learn. And I wondered, in the researching and writing of this book, How to Calm Your Mind, if you pull out the discovery that fascinated you the most, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. It would have to be the science of savoring. Now, the fascinating thing about enjoying life is just because we experience something pleasurable, does not mean we'll derive any satisfaction from it whatsoever. So I have this amazing cinnamon green tea in front of me in this mug that you can see because we're on video. And, just because I sip on this doesn't mean that I'll derive any satisfaction from whatsoever. I could be drinking the most delicious cup of tea that has ever been produced in the history of the world. 3-star Michelin green tea, and not derive any satisfaction from it whatsoever. But savoring is the name for the process of converting a positive experience into a positive emotion. And we can do this by marveling at an experience. That's a type of savoring. So think of how you look out across the ocean, or up at the stars, or enjoy your breath during meditation, as we were just doing. We can also luxuriate in an experience and ruminate about it positively. So think of a cat stretching out into the sun and just soaking it up. And we can practice gratitude as well. And we can even savor the past and the future. So we savor the past when we reminisce about it, when we look back on previous memories and think about all that is good. And even looking through old photos works for that too. And anticipation is a way of savoring the future. And so when we count down the days to a trip, to an event, to something that we want to be more present at, the research shows that anticipating something creates these effective memory traces in our mind, kind of like a path that we walk down, that we then walk down again, that leads to more savoring when we actually experience something. So that was the interesting thing is, we have all these aspects of our life that pull us out of the moment. We have this craving for more that we have a lot of the time. We have a deep desire, a chemical desire for novelty in our brain, where our brain rewards us for each time we tend to something that's distracting. But counterbalancing these through something like savoring, which actually activates the here and now network in our brain that leads us to more presence and focus. And I think that's ultimately all productivity is about, all enjoying life is about, is finding the presence and the state of mind to be fully immersed with what you're doing in the moment. And so savoring is this marvelous practice where we get to enjoy the good things in our day, because why not get better at that and enjoy the fruits of our accomplishment, while at the same time cultivating this peace of mind and the presence to be with something that is good in our life. And so there are so many different subjects that fascinate me from the things that I had the opportunity to explore in writing this book. But savoring comes to mind as something that changed the game for me when it comes to calm.
When you're savoring, you're in the present. As you say, you can savor past and future. And I'll join you. I have my ember heated mug with some Nespresso in it, and
lovely.
The difference between just having a sip and savoring is it kind of extending the presence. So I forget you and I drink. I taste the heat. I taste what's sort of the granularity of the savoring in the moment. So if you wanted to practice it, what kinds of things would you do with a cup of tea?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, for practicing it, one of my favorite techniques is the savor list. And so just kind of capturing every part of everyday experiences that you wish to be fully present in. But it's a distinct actual thing that is studied, savoring, from mindfulness, but it's kind of a cousin of mindfulness in a way, where mindfulness, you appreciate the moment with a non-judgmental awareness. Maybe appreciate is the wrong word, but you notice the moment with non-judgmental awareness. Whereas with savoring, you notice all that is good in the moment and all that is pleasurable and enjoyable. And so it's kind of a subset of mindfulness in a way, where whenever your attention wanders from whatever is good in that moment that you are appreciating and enjoying, you gently bring it back. When you start thinking about your day and all that you have to get done afterwards, when the guilt comes in from savoring, because we have a lot of guilt when we try to relax. You simply recenter around the positive things that you're experiencing in the moment. So that was the interesting thing, is how it's distinct from mindfulness. It's distinct from flow as well, which is a bit more distantly related to savoring. But it's basically positive rumination on the good.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. Positive rumination on the good. Your book was released December 26th, and
yeah,
since then, you've had lots of good conversations about the book. You've heard from readers and interviewers. What has been the most surprising part of the reception to the book so far that you've experienced?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The interesting thing with the reception is, I've written books on productivity, and I'm fortunate that those have found an audience around the world. And so calm is a very new subject for me, even though there is that direct relationship with productivity. So I actually think we make our time back that we spend investing in calm for reasons that I break down in how much more focus we have and how anxiety compromises our cognitive capacity by a significant margin, about how we can overcome burnout by finding calm as well. And so the opposite of burnout is engagement. So there's productivity benefits to be had there too. But the most rewarding for me so far is hearing the feedback from people who have read the book and integrated the strategies in it into their life. And maybe this is the fact that it's a different subject from productivity. So, productivity advice has a tremendous benefit for the work that we do. And it lets us accomplish more. It lets us become less stressed by our work. It lets us compartmentalize the work in our life and optimize not only the benefits, but also the contributions of the work that we do. But calm, when you break down the benefits that a calm mind can provide, they extend beyond that of just productivity. They allow us to become more creative. They allow us to become more resilient because we become more resilient to future stress. We have a greater capacity to absorb it. Calm lets us experience more meaning, especially when we're able to notice how our actions are aligned to what we value. Calm lets us derive more satisfaction from our life, depending on what strategies we invest in, like savoring off the top, what we chatted about. And so I think, just the fact that calm can have such a profound influence on so many different areas of our life beyond just work. And I shouldn't be so surprised to have found that, but it's fascinating because these ideas have completely changed how I relate to my own work and my own life. And so I guess it's not a surprise that people are thinking about their anxiety and stress and burnout a bit differently, but that's been an immensely rewarding part for me. Horn tooting over.
No, feel free.
It's not Canadian of me though. I can't do it. I can't do it.
You should be texting me things and then I'll toot back or something.
Okay.
One of the areas I thought was pretty intriguing was the whole burnout topic, and you found an expert on burnout, and she had 6 factors which you can sort of measure as to how close you are to burnout. And I suspect that, having a book out, being on tour, the things that you've done, if you could go through the 6 factors and rate yourself on them this week as to how you're doing in each of those dimensions.
Yeah, that's a great question because I'm probably experiencing more stress from them with all the book stuff happening. So I think the first thing that's important to communicate is just what burnout is. So we tend to think of burnout as exhaustion, and we'll interchange those words colloquially as well. So we'll say at the end of the day, I'm so burnt out, when we're just wiped from the day that we had. But burnout, there's a ton of just fascinating research surrounding this phenomenon. that shows that burnout is not exhaustion. So we need three things to be true about our situation for us to qualify as being burnt out. We need that exhaustion, that state of just total depletion. But we also need cynicism is the second attribute of burnout. Like there's this negativity behind what we do, like we're kind of depersonalized from the work that we do. And inefficacy is the third dimension. So where we feel deeply, profoundly unproductive, as if our actions do not make any modicum of a difference whatsoever. And so experiencing one of these things is a sign that we're kind of on our way to burnout. These are stepping stones to that. And I did, allude a bit earlier how the opposite of burnout is engagement. And so instead of being exhausted, we're fired up. Instead of being cynical, we feel there's a positivity behind what we do. Instead of feeling ineffective, we feel as though we're making a difference. And the fascinating thing about burnout and exhaustion is, like you mentioned, there's these 6 factors of our situation that are variables. And depending on how much chronic stress we experience in each of the 6 areas, that determines where we are in the sliding scale between engagement and burnout. And so workload is the first one. So the more that our workload eclipses our capacity to get things done, the closer we become to burnout. My workload has been quite high, so I've actually experienced a significant amount of chronic stress. I kind of hesitate to use the word chronic, actually.
Maybe acute.
Acute stress. Definitely acute stress. And that's an important distinction to make in and of itself. So we have these 2 types of stress that we face. And this is obvious advice, but it's worth reiterating. We have acute stress, which is once off, chronic stress, which is repeated. And acute stress is actually great for us over the longer arc of time. That's the book launches. That's the big things you're shipping at work. Acute stress are family reunions, their weddings. If you went through your life and scrubbed all the moments of acute stress, you'd get rid of a large amount of meaning in your life at the same time. So I might say the book launch is a form of acute stress, workload wise, but there are elements of it that are more chronic stress related. So speaking ramps up around book launches, and that'll be stressful over the longer arc of time as well as meaningful. Lack of control is the next one. So the less we feel we're in control of our situation, the more stress we experience. So I'm fortunate. I can say no to things. I can say yes to things. I have my schedule, my life. I can kind of manage things and run things in that way. Reward is number 3. And so reward refers to not only financial reward, so how well we're compensated, stock bonuses are included, financial salaries are included in that, but also recognition. And so being recognized for our contributions that we make, I'd say, I experience significantly less stress in this area than I did before, because it's so rewarding to have a book out there and hear what people think and hear about people who are benefiting from it after many years of struggling through living a lot of this advice. I finally get to share it with the world. So that's number 3. Community is number 4. So how close we feel connected with other people. That's been, of course, an incredible thing lately in getting to talk to people about the book. So less stress from there. Fairness is the 5th factor. So how fairly we feel we're treated. I'd say that's about neutral. I feel I'm usually pretty good in that dimension. And values is number 6. And so when we are misaligned, when our deep values are misaligned to the work that we do. So if we value caring for other people and our work is ruthless, it's cutthroat, it's going to be misaligned, and we're not going to be able to get a lot of meaning from that, as well as we'll experience more chronic stress. And so it's interesting looking at this picture where there are kind of, there are some elements of my work where I'm experiencing more chronic stress, but most of it is positive acute stress, which we relate to differently. And acute stress does not contribute to burnout. Burnout is solely caused by chronic stress that accumulates to a tipping point where we have too much of it at a certain point. Certain threshold is crossed, and then we reach a state of burnout. But fortunately, things are going well in this regard, but they change over time. And I think that's why it's so critical to check in with these factors. I don't do it every month. I don't do it every week. I'd probably do it once a quarter as the tectonic plates, the projects that comprise my work shift around. So pretty good at this moment. But yeah, what about you?
Oh, well, yeah. I actually drew a graph of the chronic stressors in my life when I was reading through the book, and it was just helpful to put names on, what they were.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in what you just said, how they can shift, because I can imagine in the time that you're working mainly in a solitary way on your book, the reward and the community part is you don't really know what the reward is going to be. And maybe there's some anxiety and you're alone, you're not in the community. So in this phase of it, those become kind of, benefits in dealing with stress. So that you can see how they kind of move around like, audio waves on a mixer or something, that depending on your situation, and it's a symphony, not just one thing.
It's fascinating. And so there are times in my work where I realize I'm more stressed, and so I need more community. That'll be a salve for that. There are times when I don't feel as rewarded, or maybe that sense of community, so I'll agree to speaking engagements that might not make sense if I'm hunkered down on a big project. And so it's interesting how if we notice that more chronic stress is arising, we can counterbalance that for the other factors that kind of absorb that stress, which is fantastic. Yeah, and full credit, you mentioned the researcher when you asked the question. Christina Maslach is, who, in my opinion, the world's foremost expert on the subject of burnout. She is the co-inventor, along with Susan Jackson, of the Maslach Burnout Inventory, which is the most commonly used instrument for diagnosing burnout. And so that's worth mentioning. If you find that your chronic stress is super high on a bunch of these dimensions, and you find that you're on your way to burnout, you're exhausted, you're cynical, you feel ineffective, or some combination thereof, turn to the test. It's $15, and it's worth conducting if you find that you may be out of whack.
Yeah. I was thinking of a blog post or something that it would be titled "How to Stay Calm on a Book Tour." That you would give a sort of targeted approach to this to fellow authors who are, especially a debut novel. You worked for 2 years, like your first book, The Productivity Project, and if you were going to tell that guy or another author how to stay calm on the book tour, what would you offer?
I would offer that whenever you talk about the book, make sure it's meaningful to people who are listening. Make sure it's valuable, and really approach a book tour and any promotion from a service mentality. Try to genuinely help people from the ideas in your book, because if they're helped by your interview, they're going to be helped by the book, and so they're more likely to pick it up. And if they don't, you'll have helped people, and what's better than that? And so I and this works really well for me because I really value contributing to others, or at least making an effort to. And so really connecting with those values on the book tour, I think, is critical. And that makes everything else manageable because you're doing it in service of other people and instead of yourself. And it kind of helps everybody out at the same time. It makes the process, to go back to the reward attribute of burnout, makes the process so much more rewarding. Because I don't know how many folks will hear our conversation today. A small percent of those will by the book, everybody else will hopefully still be helped by the book.
Yeah.
And so we help everybody out. So that's my kind of philosophy, but the service mentality, I think, is critical with promoting something.
Yeah, and that's kind of freeing, and it kind of takes the focus off myself when I think of what I'm doing that way. There's a lot to that.
Yeah.
Um, I think that last time we talked, or maybe it was a different interview, there was an interesting scene that you talk about when you're getting together with your editors at Penguin, and you've got an idea for a new book. And like in this case, I'm going to write a book about calm. And the question is, should it be a blog post? Should it be a book? Should it be an Audible? And I could picture that when you first started saying, I'm going to write a book about calm, they said, oh, good, this is going to be a 500-page book because calm affects everything, or everything affects calm. But do you recall when you were first envisioning the book with your editors, the shape of it in terms of the length and what you would try to corral this really big, important idea into as a product?
The interesting thing about this book is I didn't really intend to write it. I went through this burnout. I went through this anxiety before the pandemic. This is, I think, burnout is something that most definitely more of us are acquainted with post-pandemic, because if you think of burnout as the result of the totality of chronic stress that we're experiencing at a given time, a great way to pile on chronic stress with work, with home, is a global pandemic, it turns out.
That'll work.
Yeah, that'll do the trick. And especially when a lot of that stress is threatening. When that occurs, that produces a lot of anxiety as well. Just as burnout is a spectrum, as shown by the research that goes from burnt out to engaged, calm is actually a spectrum too. I found out looking at deep into the research that goes from calm to highly anxious, and depending on how emotionally reactive we are and whether we relate to our thoughts in a positive or a negative way. And I actually, the impetus for this particular book was one that I did not expect to encounter. I was on just a speaking event, and when I got up on stage one day, I was chatting about one of the productivity books. I noticed that when I got up there, that these beads of sweat were starting to form on the back of my neck. I noticed my heart rate spiking. I noticed just sweating and stammering and stumbling on my words. And I was having an anxiety attack on stage on that particular day. And I actually thought I was doing a good job of investing in self-care at the time, though. I'm really big into meditation. I love going to the spa with my wife, reading good books, sinking into good books. And so I remember asking at the time, just for my own personal, almost self-preservation, what do I have to do to experience calm and make it last? I wasn't sure the relationship between productivity and calm, between stress and calm, how productivity is sometimes a source of stress in and of itself, which is worth dissecting as well as our pursuit of more. And so it was really just a process of preserving my own mind and becoming more comfortable in my own mind that led me to the ideas in this book. And so it's kind of almost an accident that this book is created, but obviously it isn't at the same time. Once you realize you have a collection of ideas that can hopefully prove helpful to other people as they are to yourself, then I started to mold it into something shaped like a book. I don't think there was a page count or a word count in the original pitch, but it was amazing how easily that flowed, because it was part of my own story, part of my own research. And for anybody who writes nonfiction, I think that's an incredible place to look, is what are the ideas that have helped you, and what did you learn about them? What's the research behind them, if that's something you're interested in and have discovered, and how can they help other people out? And so it was really just, I don't want to say an accident because that's overstating it, because obviously it's a book doesn't appear
Hmm.
out of the ether like this, but
Hmm.
definitely the story and stumbling into the science and the advice that worked was not something I intended to write about. But sometimes you encounter ideas where you think, oh, I have to write about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I first came across your work, it was with that Audible original
Mm.
about meditation and productivity. And I think you said something then comparing reading a book versus listening to a book. And you used an image which was if you're listening to a book, say a nonfiction book about calm, and if the presentation is calm and restful, it's like water flowing over a stone and gradually changing the stone, and that sometimes in some situations it might be my mind might be more open to being changed by hearing a book than reading it with my sort of student's mind or whatever it is. And you've got a great audible version of it that you narrate, so you've got the benefit of your voice. Uh, if you had somebody who was racked with anxiety and they say, "Hey, I hear you wrote a book about calm, and I really want to change my life. Should I get the audio book or should I read it on my Kindle
Oh,
or paper?" How might you guide
oh,
someone in one direction or the other?
oh, that is so challenging to do.
I know they're both your babies, so I'm not
Yeah.
but I think there would be maybe different people might be more suited to encounter it one way or the other.
Yeah. I think we all, that's such a fascinating question. Um, I think we all kind of experience things differently when depending on how we consume them. But we also all have this incredible wealth of data at our disposal from our own personal experiences.
Right.
And so, I would be inclined to look back at the books that I have consumed in the past where I've made the greatest number of changes after consuming the book. And I would be inclined to consume the book in that kind of format.
Hmm.
And so maybe and so I think that advice generally works well for pragmatic nonfiction books, which ultimately the purpose of consuming one is to extract the maximum amount of value out of that product as possible. And so I would look in the past to previous data points. What books did I make the most changes after reading? What format were they in? Maybe there's a trend line there. For me personally, I find that having a hardcover book or a Kindle book for that matter, where I can highlight, I can in the physical book, which is ultimately my personal favorite format, scribble in the margins,
Hmm.
tear out pages. I'm rough on a book. But when my wife and I met, and I think she almost broke up with me because of this. What I do for a bookmark, I don't have traditional bookmarks. I rip the first page out of books and just use that as a bookmark.
Oh, that's
And the
great.
look on her face when I did that for the first time, actually, the look on anybody's face when you do that, it's like you're committing a felony, like a crime. And I'll
Yeah.
probably get some hate mail from this very interview um,
The
about
Librarian
that habit.
Association.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, there will be like a cease and desist or something coming my way. Um, so I'm rough on a book, but that's the process through which I find I extract the most amount of value out of the product. And so for me, it's hardcover because that's how I like to consume books. But for other people, they might find that audio is the only format that they'll actually end up
Mm.
listening to, and that the hardcover books just tend to stack up because the ritual can't be integrated into their life. And in that case, that's better. But I think, so often with advice in general, with advice on any subject, calm, happiness, productivity, we have so much data at our own disposal, where we have all the things that have worked for us in the past. So people read books on happiness and never really think, wait, when in my life have I been the most happy?
Yeah.
Uh, Books on productivity. Wait, when was I the most productive at work? What conditions were true? Was I on a deadline? Probably. You probably were. What, was the work more fun? Was I working alongside other people? Was there that sense of community? How was my workload level? Did I feel things fair and connected with what I value? Calm is much the same way. And so, yeah, it's take what works for you, leave the rest, and look at your own data points.
I think that's one thing that's helpful about this book. And when your wife was talking about it on the podcast, I heard she admitted her bias, but she was so enthusiastic. It's your best book, and she's read it 3 times, and I think I heard that before I'd finished reading it. She's obviously a very intelligent woman, a professor and everything, and I could hear something that had touched her that was, I think, beyond the fact that her husband had written a book. And I think the stories you tell, starting with that story that's really well told and quite gripping about the moment on the stage and then the anxiety, but then all the way through, you'll take some research, you'll distill it, the research shows this, and then you'll bring a story in. And I think that maybe invites the reader to, as you say, access a story from the reader's situation. Well, that's kind of like when I did this, and that you're sort of opening portals to people's experience by risking sharing real stuff from your own life.
Yeah, there's a monk that I love to follow. His name is Ajahn Brahm, and he has a lot of great videos on YouTube and a lot of great books as well. And he describes, he's very funny too. He's actually hilarious. And so you'll watch he swears.
A monk who swears. I like him already.
Oh yeah. And he used to be, I think, an astrophysicist before becoming a monk. And so super smart, really fascinating, and instantly interesting whenever you hear him talking. And he describes making somebody laugh. When you make somebody laugh, he describes it as though you can toss the nuggets of wisdom into their open mouth as they're laughing.
Oh, wow.
And I think, somebody's mouth isn't agape usually when they're listening to a story. But I think of stories as sort of vehicles for delivering this helpful advice. And so in writing a book like this, my job as the author is to respect the reader's time, to make sure everything is worth consuming in the book, to work as a filter for somebody for advice that's helpful. But it's also to make things interesting so it's not a textbook, and it's not, it's relatable, it's vulnerable, it's interesting, and I think above all else, it's human. Really, and it's about that connection between hopefully me and the reader. And so, so in the same way that the stories, that the funny anecdotes open somebody's mouth, you could throw the nuggets of wisdom in. I think of these stories as the vehicle that keeps moving things forward, but also delivers the science, the actual help. I'm not a huge fan of the word self-help, but the pragmatic advice that we all need to live in a way that's more true to who we are.
There was one of the little nuggets that had an impact on me is when you're talking about calm and anxiety and how anxiety reduces working memory. And I'm 72, so my working memory is noticeably not what it was when I was your age. And but it made me wonder if, as people age, my father's 95, the importance of finding calm in your life versus anxiety. I mean, we're all worried about, cognitive decline and dementia and all that. I would think that would be a pretty basic factor as we age, more so than when we're younger.
Yeah, and you hit the nail right on the head, and the research does bear that out, that our working memory capacity shrinks as we get older. And, our working memory capacity, I should say, I think we chatted about this in our last conversation, but just in case people haven't tuned in, it's essentially the mental scratch pad that we use to process the world around us. So if you multiply 84 by 64 in your head, you're using this working memory capacity. You're using it logically to multiply numbers. You're using it, the visual spatial reasoning to multiply the 2 4s and carry 4, 8, 12, carry the 1 over. And it's fascinating, though, the effect that anxiety has on our cognitive performance in this way. So if you had to give a speech to 5,000 people, and you never have, then that speech is in 5 minutes. And I asked you to multiply 64 by 84, whatever the numbers were that I mentioned. It would take you 2 to 3 times as long to do that before the stressful event. If we were on an airplane and we had a pocket of heavy turbulence and I asked you to read something, or you were reading something, you'd probably have to go back a few paragraphs to reread those paragraphs so you could actually process it. So, anxiety hijacks our attention in a way that, it pulls us out of the moment to pay attention to a threatening situation, whether that situation is an email notification, our external environment, or other thoughts happening in our head. So we have that effect, the threat finding effect, and we also have the shrunken cognitive capacity effect of it, where our working memory capacity has been shown to shrink by 20-25%. And so it's fascinating because anxiety is cognitively expensive and it consumes these precious mental resources. And so we have, over the course of the pandemic, I think something that many of us have experienced is how our work takes longer. So we have to work evenings. We seem to have more to do, even though the structure of our work hasn't changed considerably. Well, does it take 20 to 25% longer? Do you have to work, instead of 9 to 5, 9 to 7, or have 2 extra hours of work to do? Is that about your level? If you do knowledge work, that's the level that anxiety shrinks our cognitive capacity by, not to mention the threat finding, not to mention the increased negative dialogue we have with ourselves in our head, not to mention the fact that we see fewer opportunities around us. So being in a positive mental state actually increases our productivity by about 31%. And this study was conducted a while back. So do calibrate for the fact that it might not be an exact number. And of course, we're all different. But once you account for that as well, it's really quite remarkable, the effect that an anxious mind has on our productivity, but also the room that we have to grow our working memory capacity as we invest in calm. So not only does anxiety shrink our working memory, calm grows it, which is absolutely fascinating to me. Because there are so few ways to actually grow our working memory. We can't really train our mind with these mind training apps because those effects wear off the minute we stop investing in a strategy. Meditation and happiness seem to grow our working memory slightly, and as does calm. And maybe it's the effect that those have on a calm mind. So we think of relaxation, we think of calm as something that we don't have time for, and we feel guilty when we try to invest in relaxation. But after living through this journey and experiencing the negative productivity effects of an anxious mind, and not to mention the fact that it's a much less pleasurable place to spend time in than a calm, happy, productive mind, I think, calm is worth investing in for productivity alone. And this is not to mention the other benefits that we can experience because of it. So yeah, it's a fascinating connection. I debated between whether to include that chapter on productivity in the book, but I'm happy I did, because it can absolve that advice can absolve ourselves of a lot of this guilt that we feel by investing in calm.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that I tried, because it resonated, you talk about checking metrics, like checking book sales, and sort of compulsively. I guess that's a kind of a dopamine thing. If you're about to check, you might get good news and all of that. And the ones that I tried it on, every I'm always trying to lose 10 pounds. So I weigh myself every morning. And then I'm
Yeah.
always trying to sleep 7 hours because I'm not a good sleeper. So I check my Apple Health and all this. And so I
Yeah.
wake up and I get two numbers that, sometimes they're good news. And I say, hey, I slept 7 hours. I'm going to be a nice person today. Or, hey, I'm on the way. But I realized when you were writing about these things that it's probably a source of chronic stress that every day I'm giving myself something that and so I switched to just doing it every Friday. And so now the only time I check those two numbers is on Friday. And I feel a little calmer, and
Yeah.
it's felt kind of silly, but I'm interested in, well, first of all, when was the last time you checked book sales today? That I want to know that. And then why does that work to sort of spread out the sort of intervals between checking stock prices, all these different metrics that
Yeah.
sometimes we think are the source of happiness?
Well, I checked them a few hours ago. I'm not gonna lie, and I like to say I follow 90% of my advice
Ah,
90% of the time,
that makes it
and
more
so,
credible.
yeah, 90% of the advice 90% of the time, and so this is the 10% of the 10% that I'm not, but I'm kind of you
It's
know
understandable. A book is a big deal, so I'd be checking it
yeah.
every 5 minutes.
Well, yeah. So I find I'm I think the key is to check as often as the metrics meaningfully change.
Uh,
And so right now it's a global launch. It's doing, it's doing. I'm really really happy with
mm,
how it's going so far. And so I check once a day or so.
yeah.
I'd say maybe twice a day. But
Mm,
that hidden stress, I think, is the critical thing that we all need to internalize. Where just because something stimulates our mind does not mean that it makes us happy
yeah.
or any less anxious. In fact, what stimulates our mind usually serves to make us more anxious over the longer arc of time because it leads us to seek out even more novelty. The news is a really good example of this. So we'll get back to metrics in a sec, but the news is a great example of a hidden source of chronic stress in our life that we kind of grow comfortable with the stress of. So one study that I really remember encountering that shook me up and kind of changed the way I consume the news was there was a study conducted around the 2013 Boston Marathon bombings that looked at two groups of people. The first group of people were those who watched 6 or more hours of news coverage about the Boston Marathon bombings. And the second group of people were runners in the actual marathon itself on that day. And what the researchers found was that those who watched the news coverage experienced a greater level of stress than
Mm,
somebody who was in the marathon and personally affected by it.
mm,
And so we think about burnout, right? If burnout is the ultimate manifestation of chronic stress, wow, we're certainly adding a lot of chronic stress to the pile. Social media is another good example of a source of stress that we've become comfortable with simply because it's familiar, and especially about things we're familiar with, like our friends, like our favorite companies, that sort of thing. I remember watching Frances Hogan's congressional testimony, where she's the Facebook whistleblower,
oh yeah.
and she described the Instagram algorithm as being about two things: bodies and comparing lifestyles.
Mm,
And it's hard to imagine, it's kind of a hidden threat as well from social media,
yeah.
where there's this constant comparison part of our mind that's activated when we engage with it. And metrics are the same way, and things kind of fluctuate relative to our expectations, and that our expectation level is kind of what the dopamine line in a way, where if something is better than we expect it to go, then we get a nice hit because it's more novel and
Hmm.
interesting to us. And novelty is one of the factors that release dopamine, which is a neurochemical that leads us to feel as though pleasure is right around the corner. But of course, half the time things exceed this expectation line. The other half of the time they're under them, or assuming we're average at
Mm-hmm.
predicting how things will go. And then we're disappointed, we're let down, we experience a dopamine decline because of that event. And
Mm-hmm.
so things, they're speaking of Ajahn Brahm, he had a great talk where things never go wrong. He says things never go wrong. They just go differently than we expect them to.
Mm.
Things just always go. And what leads us to feel surprised or disappointed is not the event itself, but how we expected it to go. And so if you, if you expect to get a $5,000 a year pay raise and you get a $2,500 a year pay raise, things went okay. Things
Right.
presumably went okay. You got a pay raise,
Right.
but it was lower than your expectations, which, I think a lot has been written about how, low expectations are a key. But I think actually having no expectations and still trying to mold things to go well is kind of the key there. So it's interesting. Metrics, social media, the news, all of these can serve as a form of hidden chronic stress in our days when we're not careful. And so often they do, and they push us closer to burnout. They push us closer to anxiety than we think they do, and then we give them credit for.
Yeah, and I think that's such a useful idea. It was for me because the hidden sources of chronic stress turned out to be fairly easy to address. Like, well, don't weigh yourself every day. That doesn't take a lot of smarts. Or don't read the newspaper as much or whatever. And that's a benefit of the book, I think, is it raises this question. And you say, well, I wonder where my hidden sources of chronic stress are,
Yeah.
Well, let's you've got your first book was about productivity, and then there was a book about focus, and then there was a book about calm. I've been in my mind trying to imagine what is the trajectory here. And you said something that one of the thing that you're most working on as a result of this work is the human connection part of dealing with stress. And so you have a partner that you're still married, even though you're podcasting with a woman. I think there's some stress just based on that. But is the next book going to be how to calm your marriage, or something that has to do with relationships, or where do you see yourself going next?
It's funny. My editor, he said it. Well, my first book is called The Productivity Project. And he said, if you ever have kids, I will publish The Reproductivity Project.
There you go. That's a natural.
So I don't know if that's the next
that
one.
One's down the road somewhere.
Yeah. My philosophy when writing a book, and, a lot of people are thinking about their next book when they're writing the current one. Because they have all these ideas that arise in the process of writing something. For me, when an idea arises when I'm writing something, I put that in the book, even if it kind of veers off a little bit, because hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully it's interesting. If it would be worth basing a different project around, why not include that in the current project? And so that's my whole philosophy with creation is you have to always assume that new ideas will come. Because they always have, they always will. And so why not just pour everything into the current project that you're creating? And so that I think right now for me is a time of renewal before I have too many ideas for future books. Too many. And I need some kind of time to think about which ones are worth pursuing because they'll be helpful and interesting. I kind of poured everything into calm, and so now's the time of renewal before the next one. There will be a bit of time, I think, after this one.
Well, everything you put into this book really paid off. I think it was just a wonderful, wonderful effort. I have been speaking with Chris Bailey, the author of How to Calm Your Mind, Finding Presence and Productivity in Anxious Times, released in December by Penguin. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you, sir. Always good to be here.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview and that it was useful to you. I really liked how Chris talked about his purpose in writing a book like this and his other books is actually just to help people with ideas that he has found helpful to himself. There is a service mentality and vibe to his work, which I really appreciate, and I have been helped by his books. And when I heard the Audible original 2 years ago, it really kickstarted my meditation practice. When I listened to that interview again to prepare for this conversation, I was surprised to see that I had doubled my meditation after listening to that recorded. He called it an audible retreat, an audio retreat, which was a good way to see it. And if you have an Audible membership, you'll be able to find that if you just look for Chris Bailey under Audible. It was about a 3-hour conversation about meditation as a productivity tool. And in this new book, the ideas in it, I have tried some, I'm using some. I think my level of anxiety has gone down noticeably since I've started including some of the approaches that he talks about in my life in small ways and larger ways. I think it's interesting to hear that when he had a new idea as he was writing the book, he didn't save it for his next book. He put it into this one. It's that idea of leave everything on the field. And I like the way that he thinks about it in terms of there will always be ideas. And if you're saving ideas for your next blog post or your next podcast, sometimes it's kind of hoarding them, and maybe that slows down the flow of the creativity. But that I think explained why this book seems so full of ideas. It's also well organized, so it doesn't feel just like a grab bag. It's just a book that rewards multiple readings and dipping into and trying things and then continuing to go on. Chris has a podcast that he does regularly. You can find it at iTunes and other places. It's called Time and Attention. He does it with his wife, Arden Nordstrom, who is a professor in the Ottawa area. And they have a good back and forth with each other talking about, they talk about the book, and then they talk about the issues that he's exploring as he continues his journey. I love that he identified savoring as the idea that most fascinated him in all the work that he applied to this book, and then talking about it, the turning of a positive experience into a positive emotion. And that made me think of my father, because for decades now, I can remember when he was still at work at the bank, he talked about being a collector of delights. And for a while he was taking beautiful photographs, and that was part of his sensibility is to see something, take a photo of it, frame it, put it in his office. And he on his own, I think, came up with that savoring idea as a way to enhance the quality of his life and the life of those of us around him. And at 95, he'll be 96 on February 18th. He's still a collector of delights. And I was really glad this trip to be able to have coffee with him twice on 2 different days. And then today I had lunch with him in the dining room where he lives. His dignity and his delight in life and the delights that he collects is infectious, inspiring, and it makes my time with him precious indeed. And we will be connecting by video chat when I return to Sanibel. My next interview, I think, is probably going to be with A.G. Riddle. Jerry Riddle has a new book out, Quantum Radio, and I'm reading it. It's fascinating. It's a good Jerry Riddle book, and we'll have a good conversation probably coming up in a few weeks once the book is released. That's it for the Kindle Chronicles. This is Len Edgerly from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thanks for listening.